Hello, and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be reading you a true crime story called A Heartless Mother. If I pronounce any names wrong, I do apologize. Paul Boehm had been working as a bus driver in St. Louis, Missouri when he met 18-year-old Ellen Booker. Although he was married, his marriage was crumbling quickly. Ellen was young enough to be his daughter, but the attraction was too much for him to resist. Ellen, too, felt an instant attraction despite Paul's age and marital status. She was at least 100 pounds overweight, and Paul had been the first man to show any interest in her at all. Growing up, Ellen had barely known her father. He had been an emotionally and physically abusive man, a heavy drinker, and had a short temper. It was probably a good thing that he was barely ever home. When she was still a young girl, her father left her mother, just as he had abandoned his previous wife and 7 children. But when he died of cancer in 1979, Ellen had inherited 1/8 of the family farm and sold her share to her stepbrother. By the spring of 1978, Paul's first marriage had ended. 2 years later, he married Ellen. Using her inheritance and his veterans' benefits, they purchased the home they had been renting on Wyoming Street in St. Louis. A few months after moving in, Ellen's mother Christine lost her job, and Paul offered to let her move into the basement of their home. He assumed Ellen would like the idea of the mother close, but he was wrong. Ellen had worked hard to create a life on her own and didn't want her mother so close. However, she realized that having Christine would come in handy as they planned to create a family. The family came quickly. Their daughter Jessica was born in September 1981. 4 years later, Stephen was born. Immediately after she gave birth to Stephen, she became pregnant again with their son David. Even before she met Paul, Ellen Boehm had developed an obsession with professional wrestling. Not the kind of wrestling you see in the Olympics, but theoretical, choreographed wrestling featuring muscled men with names like Brutus Beefcake, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Hulk Hogan. Initially, Paul attended the wrestling matches with Ellen, but couldn't quite understand her strange fixation on the silly sport. It was a relief for him when Ellen met Deanne Smith. Deanne was an extreme fan of professional wrestling as well. They were 2 peas in a pod. The two started attending matches together, often traveling overnight just to see their favorite wrestlers. This arrangement was fine with Paul, who would rather spend his time and money drinking in bars. Ellen Boehm had returned from an overnight wrestling trip with Deanne just in time for her and Paul's 6th wedding anniversary, when Paul gave her some bad news. During his time in Vietnam, he had been exposed to Agent Orange, a herbicidal warfare chemical that later caused major health problems for those that had been exposed to it. As a result, he often broke out in rashes all over his body. He told Ellen that the military would cover his treatment, but he would need to travel to Texas to stay in a military hospital. He would have to quit his job because the treatment would take several months. Ellen was 8 months pregnant with David when Paul left for Texas. Deanne Smith was going through a difficult divorce at the time and thought it was odd that Paul's doctors hadn't consulted with Ellen before such a major treatment. It sounded suspicious. She suggested Ellen drive to the hospital and see if he had even parked his car there. Initially, Ellen thought it was unlikely that Paul would have left her just a month before their 3rd child was born. But after a few weeks, without a word from Paul, she took Deanne's advice and drove to the hospital. Just as she had suggested, his car wasn't there. Ellen was still in denial that her husband had left her. But when a former co-worker confirmed Paul had been having an affair with a young girl named Terry, she knew her marriage was over. David Boehm was born in the summer of 1986, and Paul showed up at the maternity ward to play the part of the proud father. He held David in his arms and posed for a photo, but it would end up being the only time he ever saw his son. 2 weeks later, Paul moved to Dodge City, Texas, with his new girlfriend Terry. Ellen and Paul were divorced not long afterwards, then he married Terry. Paul was on his 3rd wife and had left Ellen the same way he'd left his previous wife. Ironically, this was the same way Ellen's own father had abandoned his 2 families. After the divorce, Ellen immersed herself in professional wrestling. She and Deanne often traveled for long weekends out-of-town events, sometimes following the wrestlers from town to town to watch the same choreographed shows every night. Ellen had an active imagination. She often told friends and co-workers that she was having a romantic relationships with the wrestlers. She developed an obsession with one wrestler in particular, Ted DiBiase, known as the $1 Million Man. Every chance she got, she would desperately try to speak to DiBiase. She yelled to him as he walked down the aisle toward the ring on event nights and waited in the hotel bars where he stayed, hoping to get a chance to flirt with him. She tried to flirt with many of the wrestlers, but at well over 300 pounds, none of them were interested in her. She threw herself at them, only to be rejected each time. The rejection, however, didn't keep her from fantasizing. She made up stories of torrid love affairs that she regularly shared with her friends. In Ellen's mind, the men couldn't resist her, when the truth was that they wanted nothing to do with her. Ellen's obsession with wrestling was an unhealthy escape from reality. Ellen worked a data entry job at an accounting firm, but it wasn't enough to make ends meet. She took a second job 4 nights a week delivering pizza in order to feed her kids and still be able to travel for wrestling matches. Despite the extra job, however, it still wasn't enough, and the bank foreclosed on the house that she had purchased with Paul. Ellen and her 3 kids moved into the Riverbend City apartments along the banks of the Mississippi River. Although she couldn't afford to pay her mortgage, Ellen always found a few $100s to spend every weekend on wrestling matches. Ellen and Paul's divorce decree stated that Paul was obligated to pay monthly child support for his 3 children, but it didn't happen. Ellen never saw a dime. Still unable to pay the bills, she filed for bankruptcy in September 1987. Although it paid off her debts, her paychecks were being garnished and she was unable to pay the utilities. Thanksgiving 1988 was busy for Ellen. After having a traditional Thanksgiving meal, she drove her 3 children into downtown St. Louis to see the department store window displays that had been decorated for Christmas. 2-year-old David grew tired throughout the day and slept in the back of the car as she drove home. But by the time they arrived home that evening, just after 9 p.m., David was wide awake. He had gotten his second wind and wanted to watch television. It was Ellen's night to watch her favorite show, Knots Landing, and David wanted to watch too. Ellen sat on the sofa, and David laid on the floor with a pillow to watch the show. It's unclear what was going through Ellen's mind as she watched the show. Perhaps she contemplated the frustration she felt by raising 3 kids on her own, or having Thanksgiving dinner without the love and support of a husband. Ellen moved from the couch and knelt on the floor just behind David as the boy watched television. She pulled a cushion from the couch, moved the boy onto his back, and placed the cushion over his face. She put her weight on the edges of the cushion and held it tight across his face until his kicking and resistance stopped. Ellen sat back down on the sofa while David lay unresponsive on the floor. His lips had turned a pale shade of blue. She calmly picked up the phone and called her friend Sandy, a friend she had known since high school. Ellen made small talk with Sandy, and the 2 women discussed their Thanksgiving holiday. All the while, David lay at her feet motionless. After 15 minutes of casual conversation, Ellen suddenly cut Sandy off. She told her that her son David was lying on the floor, then stopped breathing and was turning blue. Ellen explained she needed to hang up and call 911. Several minutes later, paramedics arrived and pounded on the door, but there was no answer. They pounded again, still nothing. Several minutes passed when Jessica finally answered the door and explained that her mother had gone downstairs. The paramedics entered the apartment to find David unresponsive on the floor. He was in cardiac arrest. Their initial attempts to revive him were unsuccessful, and they prepared him for the ambulance. After 10 minutes, Ellen finally returned. She told the emergency team she had gone downstairs to find help. She seemed strangely calm and explained that David had been sick earlier in the day. Paramedics offered to let her ride in the ambulance with her son, but she declined. She said she would just meet them at the hospital. When the paramedics left the apartment with David, Ellen called Sandy back and asked if she could watch the kids for the evening while she went to the hospital. When David arrived at the emergency room, doctors were unable to resuscitate him and placed him on life support. His body temperature reached 101 degrees, and doctors used ice to keep the temperature down. That evening, doctors thought it was strange that Ellen didn't stay by David's side throughout the night. Instead, she informed hospital staff that she would go back home to get some sleep and return in the morning. The next morning, just after 9 a.m., Ellen returned to the hospital and told nurses she had a good night's sleep. David's condition had not changed. From the hospital, Ellen called Deanne to tell her what had happened. Deanne rushed to the hospital to be by the side of her friend in her time of need, but she noticed Ellen didn't seem to be upset at all. Deanne was showing more emotion than Ellen. She assumed Ellen must have been up all night at David's bedside and was just in a state of shock and exhaustion. After lunch, Ellen told Deanne she would take a nap in the waiting room, and Deanne thought that was a good idea. She didn't know that Ellen had just had a full night's sleep. While Ellen slept, Deanne stayed by David's bedside, rubbing his cold legs. Deanne sat with David into the late evening and woke Ellen at 11 p.m., who was still asleep in the waiting room. She had slept the entire day. David's doctors had finished a brain scan, but the boy's brain was showing no activity at all. Late that night, as they drove home, Deanne noted that Ellen still didn't seem to be that upset about David's condition and said, "You must have been exhausted having stayed up all night with David." She was astonished to hear Ellen admit she had gone home and slept the night before. Deanne stayed with Ellen that night. In the morning, Deanne called the hospital, but the news wasn't good. David had shown no signs of recovery. When they arrived back at the hospital, Ellen lifted David's eyelids, looking for any reaction at all. Nothing. That afternoon, doctors performed one last brain scan, but there was no change. David was not coming back. Although he was technically still alive, he was only being kept alive by machines. Doctors told Ellen that without the life support machines, David would live for less than an hour. With no show of emotion, Ellen plainly told doctors, "Pull it," giving her consent to remove David's life support. The doctors had never seen a parent with such detachment. Deanne noticed a slight smirk on Ellen's face that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The doctors pronounced David Boehm dead at 3:40 p.m. on November 26, 1988. Ellen sat in a rocking chair in the hospital room holding David's body just after his death. She rocked back and forth a few times and said, "Mommy loves you." But Deanne was troubled by the insincerity in her tone. The medical examiner determined David had died of sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, also known as crib death. Normally only occurred in infants less than 1 year old. David, however, was 28 months. It was almost unheard of for a child of that age to die of SIDS. The day after David's death, Ellen arranged for his funeral, then bought tickets for herself and Deanne for an upcoming wrestling match. Deanne suspected it was her odd way of coping with the loss. Paul Boehm found out of his son's death not from Ellen, but from his mother-in-law. When he called Ellen, she complained that she couldn't afford a funeral for David. As a veteran, Paul suggested she use his veterans' benefits for a no-charge burial at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery, but Ellen wouldn't hear of it. She wanted him to pay for a proper funeral. David was buried at the Trinity Cemetery. Friends and co-workers in attendance said it was one of the saddest days they've ever experienced. Deanne was too distraught over the death and couldn't get herself to attend. Ellen, however, seemed cold and calm at the funeral, baffling others of her lack of emotion. Paul was upset that Ellen had not buried David using his veterans' benefits, but he really had no say in the matter. He had only even seen his son once in his entire life. Ellen's co-workers held a collection to raise money for her, knowing that she was working 2 jobs, got no support from Paul, and had to pay for the funeral herself. Ellen held a $5,000 life insurance policy on each child provided by her employer. However, despite the $5,000 and another $1,000 raised by co-workers, she refused to pay the $2,348 funeral bill. Instead, she bought a new car. After David's death, Ellen's life returned to normal. She got regular manicures and continued attending wrestling matches. According to those around her, she almost seemed more upbeat than before. One would think that having just lost a child, Ellen would be protective of her surviving children, but her actions showed exactly the opposite behavior. She enlisted her mother to watch her kids while she went on wrestling trips, often not calling to check on them at all. During August 1989, Ellen began calling insurance companies to get quotes for additional policies on Jennifer and Stephen. She already had policies for $5,000 each from her employer, but she wanted more. She purchased several policies until each child was insured for $100,000. Ellen wasn't able to pay for her phone bill, which was inevitably disconnected. but she found the money for insurance policies, wrestling matches, and manicures. September 13th, 1989 was like any other day at the Boehm household. Ellen came home from work, cleaned the house, and made dinner. That night, after tucking Stephen into bed and reading him a story, Jennifer brought her Barbie dolls in the bathroom to take a bath before bed. Jennifer wasn't aware that her mother watched from the hallway while she washed herself and her dolls. As Jennifer rinsed her face and hair, Ellen plugged a hairdryer into the wall socket in the hallway and silently tossed it into Jennifer's bathwater. The electricity coursed through Jennifer's body as she frantically tried to get out of the tub. With her eyes closed, she had no idea what was going on or where the pain was coming from. She only knew she had to get out of the tub. Jennifer's screams woke Stephen, who ran toward the bathroom. When she saw Stephen, Ellen unplugged the hairdryer and calmly asked her daughter, how did the dryer get into the tub? A small bit of blood came out of the corner of Jennifer's mouth as she unsuccessfully tried to speak. Ellen told her to get dressed and they would go to the emergency room. Both kids were screaming, and Ellen went down the hall to the apartment of a friend who was a medical student. He wasn't home. However, Jennifer and Stephen's scream had attracted the attention of neighbors who called the police. As Ellen and the kids stood outside of the building, waiting for the police to arrive, Ellen made sure that the two of them had their story straight. Ellen told the children that Stephen had woken up, saw that Jennifer had washed the Barbie doll's hair, and thought they would need to have their hair dried, so he plugged in the hairdryer and accidentally dropped it into the tub. Jennifer protested, knowing that it was a lie. Stephen had been asleep when it happened and was nowhere near the bathroom. Once at the emergency room, Jennifer reluctantly repeated the lie that it was all Stephen's fault. After an examination, police noticed her pupils were dilated and she had perpetual hemorrhages on her tongue, but otherwise she was okay and released. 9 days later, Friday, September 9th, was Stephen's 4th birthday. The following day, Ellen brought him for a scheduled doctor visit to get his DTaP and oral polio vaccines. The doctor gave him a clean bill of health, but said that the pertussis vaccine may give him a mild fever and make him a little sick. According to Ellen, Stephen couldn't eat the rest of the day and vomited that evening. The following day, Sunday, she said he wasn't feeling much better, slept most of the day, and she fed him only liquids. On Monday morning, Ellen planned to stay home from work to take care of Stephen, claiming he was still feeling the side effects of the vaccines. After sending Jennifer off to school, Ellen took Stephen to her mother's house for a quick visit. After leaving her mother's apartment, Ellen stopped by a payphone to call work. At 8:15 a.m., she told them she was taking Stephen to the hospital, saying, "The same thing that happened to David is happening to Stephen," but that was a lie. As they drove toward their apartment, they passed the funeral home where David's funeral had been held. Stephen told his mother, "I want to see David," and cried. She drove him to the cemetery so he could visit his brother's grave. At 11:30 a.m., Stephen stopped at a payphone again to call her work. This time she claimed they were going back to the hospital a second time. She told her employer they couldn't find anything wrong with him, but since then, he had stopped breathing again. After the call, Ellen drove back to the apartment where he sat in front of the television and watched Sesame Street while she cleaned the house. That afternoon, Stephen fell asleep in front of the television again. Ellen knelt on the floor next to her son, took the pillow from under his head, and smothered him. Ellen ran out of the apartment and past the medical student's door. She went up the elevator to the 8th floor to her friend Pauline's apartment, but she was on the wrong floor. Pauline lived on the 6th floor. Ellen then took the elevator back down to her own apartment and knocked on the door of Todd, the medical student, who immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived at 12:59 p.m. to find Stephen unresponsive on the floor. She told him he was watching television and suddenly stopped breathing. Paramedics rushed Stephen to the hospital, and again Ellen refused to ride an ambulance, preferring to drive herself. The ambulance arrived at the hospital at 1:24 p.m., but Ellen drove to her mother's house first and didn't arrive at the hospital until 2 p.m. From the hospital, Ellen called Deanne and left a message at her work saying, "The same thing that happened to David happened to Stephen. He died sometime during the middle of the night." At 4 p.m., Ellen called her work again to tell her co-workers that doctors were considering taking Stephen off life support, but the truth was Stephen had been pronounced dead 15 minutes earlier. Ellen couldn't seem to keep her story straight and gave everyone she spoke to a slightly different version. Her stories got more convoluted when her co-worker came to the hospital to console her, and she wasn't wearing her work clothes. She had specifically told them she had taken Stephen to the hospital after she had dressed for work. Ellen seemed stoic at the death of her son. She spoke matter-of-factly about his death and that they had donated his eyes after his death. Just minutes after her son's death, Ellen spoke to a friend in the hospital's waiting room and noted young, handsome men, as if she had completely forgotten what had just happened. Ellen pointed to the men and said, "I don't know what to do. Both of those men want to go out with me. They work at my office." Deanne was confused and suspicious of Ellen's stories. She had been told that Stephen died in the middle of the night, not the afternoon. Deanne was the first to notice that Ellen's stories made little sense and were a little too convenient. Nobody loses two children of SIDS, particularly not within a year of each other. Deanne called a friend that was a police sergeant, and he put her in touch with a homicide detective. Doctors tested Ellen and Jennifer for genetic cardiac issues and abnormal heart arrhythmia, but both checked out fine. The medical examiner that examined Stephen's body had ruled out all possible causes of death except for drugs, drowning, or mechanical asphyxia. When the toxicology report came back negative, the medical examiner sent his finding to 7 respected medical experts for their opinions. Every expert ruled out any cause of death other than mechanical asphyxia. After learning the cause of death, police became concerned for Jennifer's safety and contacted Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services questioned Jennifer, and she initially gave Ellen's made-up version of the bathtub incident. Eventually, however, she broke down and told the truth. She admitted that her mother had instructed her to blame it on Stephen. He was actually asleep when the hairdryer fell into the bathtub. Investigators began talking to Ellen's friends, neighbors, and co-workers. Through various interviews, detectives learned of the additional life insurance purchases and the inconsistent stories from the day of Stephen's death. In early 1991, police had gathered enough evidence to arrest Ellen Boehm. FBI assisted local law enforcement in the arrest, and she was pulled over as she drove home from work. In the interrogation room, detectives spread out reams of paper on the table and placed elaborate charts on the walls. The information all pertaining to her finances, insurance policies, and the children's medical records. Within minutes, Ellen confessed. Displaying little emotion or remorse, Ellen explained to detectives that she had been overwhelmed with debt, was getting no financial help from Paul, and felt she had no choice but to murder her children. To avoid the death penalty, 32-year-old Ellen Boehm pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. Custody of his surviving daughter Jennifer was not awarded to Paul Boehm. At 8 years old, she was handed over to the Missouri Department of Social Services. Where is Ellen Boehm now? As of 2017, Ellen is incarcerated at the Women's Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Vandalia, Missouri. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.